In this section, let's talk about the distributions of C3 and C4 plants across the landscape, across continents around the world, and the ways in which carbon isotope analysis can inform us about these distributions. Guideline number 7. The spatial and temporal patterns of C3 and C4 abundances can be predicted on the basis of simple biochemical principles. That is, physiology and biochemistry matter in determining the distributions of these plants. When we're comparing the abundances of C3 and C4 plants, it's important to compare within a life form. That is, are we comparing within a life form, or are we comparing between life forms? In this example, we're looking at C3 and C4 grass abundances in the Great Plains of North America. Here, we're looking at C3 trees and C4 grasses in savanna systems of Africa, South America, and Australia. As long as we know what we're comparing, we can make some very reliable predictions. Where life gets a little challenging is if we don't have above ground vegetation and we're looking at the soils. It's important to know that unless we have another biomarker characteristic of the trees that allows it to be distinguished, the landscape to be distinguished from that of a grass, it's very hard to use carbon isotope ratios to know if we're looking at comparisons within a life form or between life forms. C3, C4 changes are occurring at a very rapid pace now globally. Around the world, in tropical and subtropical regions, rainforests are being cleared as pastures, some not well maintained, and pastures that are very well maintained. Here we find C3 trees and C4 grasses. Or we find the removal of the rainforest and an agricultural system comes in. Whether it's a C4 corn or a C4 millet, we find, or a C4 sugarcane, we find that a lot of the vegetation that comes in from our agricultural purposes is a C4 type. The distributions of C3 and C4 plants in grasslands, savannas, and steppe systems shows a very clear pattern. C4 plants tend to dominate in equatorial and subequatorial regions, whereas the more northerly regions and very southerly regions in terms of latitude tend to be dominated by C3 plants, with the landscape in between being a mix of C3 and C4 vegetation. So there's a broad pattern from warm to cold landscapes where you find C4 and C3 is less abundant in the equatorial regions, but more abundant in temperate regions. This can be explained by differences in light use efficiency. Here I've plotted the light use efficiency or quantum yield of C4 photosynthesis and of C3 photosynthesis. And what I want you to see is that the quantum yield decreases in C3 plants with increasing temperature, where it does not in C4. This is because of a process known as photorespiration. Photorespiration relative to photosynthesis increases with temperature, so that the decline in quantum yield or light use efficiency is associated with a relative increase in photorespiration. Because the C4 plants have a concentrating mechanism and a very high CO2 concentration, we don't effectively see photorespiration in C4 plants. So here we have a difference in efficiency between C3 and C4 plants. C3 photorespiration, again, is temperature sensitive. And this creates a temperature-dependent trade-off, where C3 plants might be advantageous in cooler environments and C4 plants advantageous in warmer environments. Now, the quantum yield and photorespiration are sensitive to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So in a C3 plant. In a C4 plant, it's insensitive to CO2 concentration. But in C3 plants, we find the same increase in photorespiration response curve, but we see that the crossover temperature is different. This allows us to evaluate a trade-off between C3 and C4 in terms of prediction based on both temperature and CO2. So we can have a global perspective and a temporal time series perspective. So that effective, we can say, over a range of CO2 concentrations and over a range of growing season daytime temperatures, we have a space in which C4 plants are favored, that is low CO2, warmer temperatures, or a space in which C3 plants are favored, that is cooler temperatures, higher CO2 concentrations. This graphic allows us to make a prediction as to the distribution of C3 and C4 taxa. One of the first people to explore the variation in C4 abundance was Larry Thiessen when he was an instructor at Augustana College in South Dakota. They would take students on a January field trip to Kenya, and there they would look at the savanna vegetation and then hike up to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. Along the way, they would go from savanna systems to essentially a mountain grassland. And as they looked at the carbon isotope ratio of vegetation along the way, they found that the clumps of grass that they sampled at higher elevations were all C3, had C3 photosynthesis, whereas the clumps of vegetation that they analyzed and low in the savannas were all C4, with a linear relationship in between associated with the change in temperature with elevation. The carbon isotope photorespiration model predicts that C4 plants should be superior in lower latitudes, warmer temperatures, and C3 in higher latitudes, cooler temperature. The quantum yield model predicts a trade-off, 50-50 trade-off at about 45 degrees. The vegetation clipping studies from Larry Thiessen using USDA data or Epstein using soil carbon data show that the trade-off, the 50-50 point of C3 and C4 abundance, is about 43 to 44 degrees, very close to that predicted by the quantum yield model. The quantum yield model also predicts that in places such as the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahuan Desert, where you get both winter rain and summer rain, that the vegetation in the winter, the grasses in the winter, should be largely C3, and in the summer they should be largely C4. In fact, it's a well-known observation that the grasses in Tucson and other parts of the Sonoran Desert are C3 during the winter, and during the summer those C3 grasses go dormant, and instead the landscape is dominated by C4 plants. Predictions about the abundances associated with elevation change, latitudinal change, or seasonal, all predicted by the quantum yield model, showing a trade-off favoring C3 versus C4 as photorespiration changes. So what's going to happen to the relationship with C3 and C4 in climate now that the temperatures are changing? Here we can look at the Vostok core for the last 400,000 years as we went in and out of ice ages. We went from a high CO2 to a low CO2 environment to today's very high environment. One would predict, based on what we have been talking about so far, that the current environment and certainly future environments over the next century are likely to favor C3 over C4 because of CO2 increases. So this model here of a trade-off predicts that in low CO2 periods, such as the glacial maximum, C4 plants would have occupied a much larger fraction of the Earth's surface. Today, the interglacial period, we see the distribution that we've been talking about with respect to latitude. But when did C4 plants first appear? It is thought that C4 plants first appeared when CO2 fell below some critical threshold, say maybe 500 parts per million, And in the warmest regions, we would see the abundances or the first occurrence of C4 grasses.